Welcome to Psalm 85, and this is a beautiful psalm. It's got a verse in it that will sound very familiar, either because you've read it before or because maybe you've sung the concept in a hymn or two along the way in church. But we're just going to look at this psalm because it really does provoke some beautiful thoughts and helpful thoughts for us. In the first three verses, the psalm writer is looking back to how God has restored his people kind of in the past, historically. Verses 4 to 7, he's asking for God to do that again. And so notice verses 4 and 5 really speaking of God's anger. God is angry and he's asking God to put that away. Put away your indignation. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? This is kind of the request, the cry, asking God to turn his anger away from them. And then what's the positive side of that request? Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your steadfast love. Grant us your salvation. This is the positive, if you like, asking God to not just turn away his anger, but to turn towards them in his steadfast love. Then from verse 8 down to the end, the psalm writer is really responding to a message from God. He's responding to something that God says. And right in the midst of that, we're not going to look at all of it, but right in the midst of it, you get the famous verse, verse 10. Steadfast love and faithfulness meet. Righteousness and peace kiss each other. Faithfulness springs up from the ground, and righteousness looks down from the sky. Notice all the language here of meeting and kissing, the springing up and the looking down. What does that imagery convey? There's this very definite sense of things coming together in verse 10, meeting, even kissing. There's a sort of a coinciding, a converging that's going on. And then in 11, same thing, perhaps in a different dimension. You've got the faithfulness springing up from the ground, and then righteousness looking down from the sky. So again, it's converging. So what is it that's converging? What is it that's coming together? Well, we've got steadfast love and faithfulness. The sort of steadfast love conveying something maybe of the grace of God, the kindness of God, the loyalty of God, certainly, but it's that graciousness. The faithfulness is the true reality of God, right? It's the sense that he is loyally loving forever. He's not going to break his word. He cares about truth. And so being true is important. So you've got these two combining, coming together. You've got righteousness and peace meeting one another. The righteousness of God's just demands and the peace, the shalom of everything being ordered. It's interesting how these two pairs kind of work together. Steadfast love and faithfulness. We see that all over the Old Testament. Righteousness and peace both convey a sense of order. Righteousness speaking of order according to God's law, and peace, well, there is a sense in which there's a connection there as well. Order from following God's orders, that there's this sort of everything's as it should be sense to the idea of shalom. But it's also easy to see how these can be sort of held on positions of tension. God's steadfast love, yes, but he's also true. God's righteousness, that's serious, but he's also God of peace. I mean, it's not that these are contradictory at all, but somehow what the psalm writer is saying here is they hold together in God. His faithfulness coming up from the ground and righteousness looking down from the sky. We're encompassed, encapsulated. We are caught up in the converging of these realities. If you look at the verses around the peace, you'll see that in the verses just before. The righteousness here, you'll see that in the verses after. So there's a structure to what's going on here. The important thing is that it's driving us to realize that God's grace and God's justice are not opposed to one another. They come together in his character. It's kind of God that we have, thankfully, a God of justice and a God of grace. Now, we, of course, read this, and probably because of hymns that we've sung, we can't help but think of where those things really converged in the ultimate sense. And that, of course, is at the cross. It's at the cross where God's justice and God's love are seen completely in unison. No tension, no contradiction whatsoever. And so by all means, read Psalm 85 and ponder these aspects, these attributes, if you like, of God's character. Appreciate how they come together, and then allow that to nudge you towards the cross, where all of this plan of God is ultimately pulled together, and see how God's justice and God's grace are seen unhindered, united together at the cross. And then the right response to that, I'm sure, is to worship him. And share what you find with someone else. Let somebody else enjoy this psalm as well. See you next time for Psalm 86.